Dear students, welcome to massive open online course on research methodology in history. Today we shall be discussing on medieval Christian historiography. The rise of Christianity produced a decline in the historiography of the West. Christianity began to spread in the Roman province of Judea in the 1st century AD based on the teachings of Jesus Christ. Christianity promised personal salvation after death through belief in Jesus as the Son of God. Christianity played an important role in establishing medieval Western civilization by absorbing the cultures and traditions of Rome, Greece, and Hellenistic states. It also played an important role in uniting Europe. Charity and social service practices in Christianity, like imparting education and medical care, acted as inspiration for art, culture, and philosophy that attracted the people towards the new faith. Christianity produced a fundamental change in human attitude when the focus of human thought shifted from the present to the future. It made eternal salvation of the soul superior to any other purposes of life, and hence the basic elements of Greco-Roman history writing, such as ordinary life of mankind, emphasis on the existence of the state, and safety of the commonwealth, became irrelevant after the coming of medieval Christian historiography. During this period, Christianity was itself making history that required to be recorded and preserved. The decisions of the Church in Jerusalem, the role of the martyrs, and the missionary activities in the Roman Empire needed to be preserved and documented. There was a necessity to answer the pagan charges against the new faith. The Christian historical consciousness that came up during this period was more related to the growth and evolution of the church than to history as such. Thus, by the end of the 3rd century AD, a Christian interpretation of all the mundane things gradually began to emerge. After the 5th century AD, for nearly 800 years, the Christian writers dominated the field of history writing. Medieval Christian historians. Saint Augustine is considered as the greatest figure of medieval Christian historiography. He was a theologian, philosopher, a preacher, a teacher, and a political thinker. According to Saint Augustine, the state is man-made and therefore it is an evil. The world is made by God and therefore it is beautiful and perfect. His important works included his autobiography titled The Confessions and another work named The City of God, which was written in 22 volumes, where St. Augustine maintained his pagan charges that Rome was punished not for its new religion, but for its consistent sin against paganism. His City of God suggested that men have devised a state with several forms of government, but none was suited to men, whereas God has devised the church, which is the city of God, and hence his celestial kingdom. According to Saint Augustine, the church was the reflection of the kingdom of heaven. The city of God had a spiritual goal that aimed to establish the role of theocracy that would be enforced by a divine law and through an ecclesiastical agency. The school of historiography dominated the political theory of the Middle Ages that made the declaration that God ruled human affairs and God actually ruled the theory also. Saint Augustine maintained that the two cities, the city of man with its earthly affairs and physical forces, and the city of God with its divine love and heavenly vision, will continue to exist till the Last Judgment. The former had been considered as evil. Here in this context, the former refers to the city of men. The city of men has been considered as an evil in comparison to the city of God, which was thought to be absolute in power, unlimited in scope, permanent in nature, that enabled men to attain higher knowledge and become perfect. The book became the basic of Catholic theology and dominated political theory of the Middle Ages. It was also the first effort to propound a theory between the church and the state. The city of God dominated Catholic historiography and the church historiography too, by making God as the regulator of public affairs. St. Augustine represented historical process as a struggle between good and evil, between virtue and vice, between divine and demonic, and between theocratic and secular. He perceived historical events as conforming to a divine plan. The work opposed the viewpoints of the Greco-Roman history writing, where man has been considered as the architect of their own fortunes. The Christian historiography believed that human beings were unable to achieve goals solely by their efforts, and intellect without God's grace, because human actions are blind due to the sins committed by men. Paulus Orosius was a disciple of St. Augustine. He also contributed largely to Christian historiography. Paulus Orosius based his history on the theory that ultimately the destinies of mankind, pagan, Jewish, and the Christians, are controlled by God. Orosius is considered as responsible for constructing the salvation historiography that looked upon history as unfolding story of God's plan of salvation. Now let us speak about the contributions of medieval Christian historiography. The medieval Christian historiography produced some significant impacts. It produced the concept of universal theory, or the history of the world, by tracing the evolution of man in the book of Genesis. It created the notion of providential history by considering providence as accountable for the working of historical events. Now, here in this context, we need to understand what is providential history all about. In providential history, God is considered as the controller of historical events. The decisions of God influences historical occurrences, and God gives meaning and purposes of history. So this is the basic idea behind providential history. Medieval Christian historiography also gave birth to apocalyptic history writing. It attached primary importance to the life of Jesus Christ. Now, the question comes, what is apocalyptic history? In apocalyptic history, prophetic history writing, it can be considered as a prophetic history writing that predicts the ultimate destiny of the world, foretells supernaturally inspired cataclysmic events that will transpire at the end of the world. Apocalyptic history writing is popular among the Jews and the Christians. Periodization of history was a contribution of this genre of history writing. Now we shall speak about the strengths of medieval Christian historiography. Medieval Christian historiography overcame the one-sided humanism propagated by Greco-Roman history writing by considering historical process as the reflection of God's purpose instead of human action. The universalism in Christian attitude towards history propagated equality among men. Universal history written under this genre such as the Bibliotheca Universalis, gave information about many Greek historians who were otherwise unknown. The medieval Christian historiography is not free from weaknesses also. When we talk about the weaknesses or demerits of medieval Christian historiography, the first aspect which comes within this particular purview is that this form of historical writing accepts the entire ancient pre-Christian and Jewish history without checking their authenticity. This form of history writing is closely related to revelation. Now, what is revelation? Revelation is the way in which God reveals himself. So this form of history writing is closely associated with this concept. The medieval Christian historiography tries to make a distinction between sacred and profane. According to this form of history writing, religious history was sacred, while other forms of history writing was considered as profane. And we find that according to some historians, medieval Christian historiography provided a defective chronology too. It developed an antipathy among the people for the worldly deeds of men and contributed to the exclusion of a good part of human activity from the domain of history. The historiography propagated by the Christians has built around itself an aura of guardianship, of authority and piety, which refuse to accept logic and scrutiny in most cases. The medieval Christian historiographic ideas propagated that it emphasized the communion of man with God and therefore laid importance on the eternal salvation of the soul as superior to every aspect of life. The Christian historiography spread the idea that Christ would return to earth to establish his power and thus shifted the center of gravity from the present to the future life. Inquiry, curiosity, exploration, and pursuit of truth, which are considered as essence of history writing, became casualty at the hands of the church. The spirit of research and search of reality was lost as a result of this. But we find that despite the weaknesses and demerits, Christian historiography produced a powerful impact on history writing. The medieval Christian or church historiography has corrected the one-sided humanism, substantialism, and particularism of Greco-Roman history writing. The church history writing defined history as the history of the world and adopted a single chronological framework of all historical events. Importance to providence and apocalyptic ideas gained importance in history writing with the coming of medieval Christian historiography. Saint Augustine is remarkable for what he did and extraordinary for what he wrote. If none of his written works had survived, he would still have been a figure to be reckoned with. However, more than 5 million words of his writings survive till date, virtually all displaying the strength and the sharpness of his mind. And we find that they also depicted that he possessed the rare power to attract and hold the attention of the readers in both his day and ours. His distinctive theological style shaped Latin Christianity in a way surpassed only by Scripture itself. His work continues to hold contemporary relevance in part of his membership in a religious group that was dominant in the West and his time and remains so today. Intellectually, St. Augustine represents the most influential adaptation of the ancient Platonic tradition with Christian ideas that ever occurred in the Latin American world. Now, when we talk about Platonic tradition or Platonism, what does the term mean? It is the theory that numbers and other abstract objects are objective, timeless entities independent of the physical world and the symbols used to represent them. So we find that St. Augustine is considered as the most influential adaptation of the ancient Platonic tradition with Christian ideas that ever occurred in the Latin Christian world. Augustine received the Platonic past in a far more limited and diluted way than many of his Greek-speaking contemporaries did. But his writings were so widely read and imitated throughout the Latin Christendom that his particular synthesis of Christian, Roman, and Platonic tradition defined the terms of a much later tradition and debate. Both Roman Catholic and Protestant Christian historiography owe much to St. Augustine, though in some ways each community has at times been embraced to own up with the allegiance in the face of irreconcilable elements of his thought. Augustine has been cited both as the champion of human freedom and an articulate defender of human predestination, and his views on sexuality were humane in intent but often been received as oppressive in effect. So this was an idea about St. Augustine and his contribution to medieval Christian historiography. St. Augustine was born in Tagaste, a modern Roman community in a river valley of 40 miles from the Mediterranean coast in Africa, near the point where the veneer of Roman civilization thinned out in the highlands of Numidia. Augustine's parents were of the respectable class of the Roman society, free to live on the work of others, but their means were sometimes straitened. They managed, sometime on borrowed money, to acquire a first-class education for Augustine, and although he had at least one brother and one sister, he seems to have been the only child sent off to be educated. He studied first at Tagaste in the nearby university town of Madauros, and finally at Carthage, the great city of Roman Africa. After a brief stint teaching in Tagaste, he returned to Carthage to teach rhetoric, the premier science for the Roman gentleman, and he was evidently very good at it. While still at Carthage, he wrote a short philosophical work aimed at displaying his own merits and advancing his career. At the age of 28, Augustine left Africa in 388 to make his career in Rome. He taught there briefly before landing a plum appointment as imperial professor of rhetoric at Milan, the customary residence of the emperor at that time. Milan was the de facto capital of Western Roman Empire and the place where careers were best made. Augustine tells us that he and the many family members with him expected no less than a provincial governorship as the eventual and lucrative rewards for his merits. Augustine's career ran around in Milan. After only 2 years there, he resigned from his teaching post, and after some soul-searching, he made his way back to the native city of Tagaste. There, we find that he passed his time as a culture square, looking after his family property, raising the son, Adeodatus, and we find that after some time he lost his son. The death of his son, who was still an adolescent, left Augustine with no obligation to hand on his family property, and he disposed of it and found himself at the age of 38 literally pressed into service against his will as a junior clergyman into the coastal city of Hippo, north of August. So this was how he became a clergyman. So this is a very brief background about Saint Augustine, but certainly his contribution to medieval Christian historiography has been noteworthy. He played a very important role in coming up with the concept of universal history, which was a new concept at that time, prior to which we find that emphasis on the culture of Greece, emphasis on the culture of Rome was more highlighted, but with the work of Saint Augustine, more specifically the work titled The City of God, we find the concept of universal history. And universal history played a very important role in establishing equality among men, in considering men as the children of God. So this was certainly a new contribution when we talk about medieval Christian historiography. And with this, we come to an end to the contribution of Saint Augustine in medieval Christian historiography. Thus, we can conclude by saying that medieval Christian historiography had played a very important role in shifting the focus of history from local and regional to the history of the world. By highlighting the role of divine plans in shaping human history, this school of historiography defined human contribution in history writing and indicated towards universal history of mankind. Thus, we find the concept of universal history for the first time with the coming up of medieval Christian historiography. On the other hand, by undermining human efforts or human role in the creation of historical events, medieval Christian historiography has excluded human activities from the domain of history. This has resulted in the creation of defective chronology by the church historians. Such interpretation of history has also changed the rational character of history as a discipline that considered the subject of history as based on evidences. Because we find that in the case of medieval church historiography, the interpretations were often not based on evidences, while in history, historical facts are to be framed on the basis of evidences. That is the basic criteria of the subject. The absence of concrete evidences in medieval Christian historiography behind formation of historical events made people suspicious about the authenticity of the form of history writing framed by this school of historiography in the later years. By the 5th century, a new development took place in medieval Christian historiography in Gaul, that is present-day France, where a saint named Salvian strongly protested against the factors that led to the downfall of the Roman Empire. He actually protested against Christian historiographic interpretation of the factors that contributed to the downfall of the Roman Empire. The process of decay, administrative inefficiency, corruption, increasing taxation, social disagreements, economic strain, breakdown of the laws, and the barbarian invasions came up in the Roman Empire. Salvian strongly protested against this situation in his book On the Government of God and questioned why the empire that was wholly Christian should suffer from such calamities. So thus, we find that by the 5th century, some historians started questioning about the interpretations given in medieval Christian historiography. So with this, we find that there was a trend of decline in medieval Christian historiographic writings too. So with this, I come to an end to the lecture. Thank you to all of you.